Hey everyone, I am excited that you found this video on how to structure your real estate business. If you are a real estate business owner or you're just a regular business owner, attorney Jacob Rappaport in this interview gives us so many simplistic, practical steps to structure your business. And in that, it helps you protect your assets, it helps you lower liability, and just have a simplistic structure. So I've been investing in real estate for 15 years, and after listening to this interview 3 times, I had so many different epiphanies and takeaways. So I encourage you to listen all the way through, if not listen all the way through multiple times, so you can really get everything out of this interview. And with that said, guys, enjoy the interview, and I'll see you at the end. Hey guys, it's Dave Hathaway. I'm excited today to bring in an expert interview, and we're going to be discussing today how to best structure your real estate business. And I'm honored to have Jacob Rappaport. He's an attorney locally in Maryland. He works over at 11 and Gann, located in Towson, Maryland. He's been practicing law over the past 12 years, mainly focused in real estate, law, and estate planning. He went to the University of Baltimore School of Law, member of the Maryland State Bar. He's worked with clients in 25 plus states, and he works with real estate investors structuring entities and operating docs. I am honored for him to be here to share not only his time, which is important, so I appreciate that, but also your wisdom, Jacob. Thank you for being here. I know you're very active with investors in different forums and blogs, and I've also worked with you personally where you've structured our LLC and our operating agreements. So I wouldn't bring on somebody that I don't have a high trust in. Did I miss anything in that video introduction, Jake?
I think you covered it all. It's really a pleasure, honor to be here, and thank you for having me, David.
Absolutely. We'll dive right into it, get right into the questions about the best ways to structure your real estate business. What entity do you recommend investors utilize?
So I would recommend the easiest, most simple entity is the LLC. And there are caveats, obviously. There are going to be situations where you want to shield away from an LLC, which we'll get to, I think, further on in the conversation. But the LLC is easiest to set up, provides for the most flexibility in management and ownership. So I typically stick with the LLC. Within the LLC, you can be taxed as an LLC, a partnership, an S Corp, but the LLC is pretty much the way to go.
Gotcha. I love that answer. We love simplicity. So the other ones are S Corps and C Corps, but he's recommending LLCs, which that's how we're structured. When you say LLCs are the best, what you're recommending for real estate investors, is that an LLC per property? Is that an LLC in a group of properties? Is that a management LLC? We're speaking directly to that person that's purchased maybe their first property, or this is their fifth property that they're purchasing.
There are there are really three ways to look at it. Number one is I have insurance. I don't really care. Even if it's in my own individual name, if there's an issue, they're going to go after my insurance. That's not really great because insurance only covers you so much, and there could be issues.
And you're talking about insurance there?
Correct. Property and casualty insurance, exactly.
Gotcha.
Now you want to be protected where if there's an issue with a property, you want to be limited to collection in that property. Again, if you have an LLC, it's a balloon. If there's an issue within a property within that LLC, they're limited to collect from the properties within that LLC. The more properties you have in an LLC, there's more equity there that they can collect from because they're going to go after the LLC and all of its assets. So if you look at your portfolio on a global level, let's just say you have 15 properties and each property is owned by a separate LLC. That is the absolute best way to own real estate. Each property in a separate LLC, because if there's an issue with the property, they can only go after that property, the equity in that property. So yeah, 15 properties, 15 LLCs times $300, because that's what it costs to maintain an LLC and go standing on an annual basis, is $4,500 a year. It's a lot of money on an annual basis. But if you look at it on a per property basis, it's only $300 a year. But still, there's got to be a better answer. Some people bunch properties together. They'll say, let's put 3-4 properties in an LLC. This way, you have your 15 properties. You put 3 properties in each LLC. That's now 5 LLCs. You're talking about now $1,500 instead of $4,500. But again, the issue there is that if there's an issue with one of the properties, they can go after the other 2 properties that the liability didn't stem from. So
Gotcha.
there are 2 answers to that.
So it's subjective on your risk tolerance.
Correct. Number one is you want to be as leveraged as possible because they can only go after the assets in the LLC, and if they're fully leveraged or highly leveraged, there's not a whole lot of equity to go after them. So sometimes if there's a married couple involved, we'll put liens on the property because you're using marital assets. So we suck out the equity beyond whatever mortgage is there from the primary lender. That's number one. The other thing is in Maryland, there is an entity called the Maryland Statutory Trust, where you can sort of have your cake and eat it too. Imagine if there's this LLC where you pay the one-time annual fee of $300, and each property can be held in a subset, let's call it, of that LLC, or a series of that LLC, a separate series, where each property is separate for liability purposes, but you only pay the one-time annual fee. So Maryland doesn't have a series LLC concept like Nevada and Alaska and Delaware. They have what's called a statutory trust. It serves the same purpose as a series LLC. You have subtrusts, so you have your trust and you have your subtrust. Each property is held in a separate subtrust, and the code says that as long as your books and records are kept separate, the liabilities do not cross over, and yet you only pay the one-time annual fee for the statutory trust to be kept alive. The statutory trust, typically we have the owner or the beneficiary of the statutory trust to be an LLC, and that LLC can then be owned by an individual or multiple members to be a partnership. The issue there is, first of all, it's expensive to set up if you are already involved in business, because we have to make the transfers of the real estate to get them into the subtrust. We'll do it without you incurring a transfer recordation tax, but also lenders are not extremely familiar with this concept. We have to sometimes educate lenders about it. So if you're buying a property in the subtrust initially, getting financing could be a little difficult. Refinancing your portfolio, if the properties are owned in a subtrust, can also be. I've done it successfully with a few lenders. I think some of the credit unions are a little bit more favorable to this structure, but that could be an issue. And that's why some clients stay away from the statutory trust concept.
Gotcha. No, I didn't even realize about that. That's awesome. And is that why you recommend the LLC for newer investors over just going down the road of statutory trust, because it's more red tape? And
tell you what some clients do. Some clients buy the properties in their own name. They'll finance it as if it's not a commercial property, and then they'll transfer it into an LLC. You can't transfer it into a statutory trust directly. So they got to buy it in their individual name, and then it's got to go into an LLC. You can ultimately get it into the statutory trust, but the LLC for financing purposes is definitely easier than a statutory trust. The other idea is a Nevada series LLC or Alaska. I'm doing a deal now where somebody's buying 72 units, 72 different properties, and we're actually structuring it where instead of buying the properties outright, we're going to set up 8 separate Nevada series LLCs. And each LLC is going to have, let's say, 7 or 8 properties, each in a separate series. And he'll be buying the 8 separate LLCs. You don't pay transfer recordation tax. You have your separate liability. You pay your one-time annual fee per parent LLC. And, you sort of have your cake and eat it there too. So that's how we're doing it for this client.
And they're purchasing the properties in Maryland?
All Maryland properties. All but I think 68 are Baltimore City, 3 are in Baltimore County, 4 in Baltimore County.
Gotcha. And for that, do they also have the foreign, I don't even know what it's called, but it's like the foreign LLC in Maryland? Or are they only using the LLC? So if they sell the properties, they're going to have to pay Maryland's state tax?
Yes, that's a great question. So because they're owned by a Nevada series LLC, yes, the answer to your question is really they should be registering the Nevada LLC in Maryland as well, because the properties are located here and you're operating your business here. That's an added expense. You're still saving a whole lot of money.
But they're choosing not to do that.
No. I think we're going to be registering it as a foreign LLC in Maryland. Yeah, you're going to have.
Okay, but are they only registering one foreign entity in Maryland, or are they registering all the 8 different LLCs in Maryland?
There are 8 LLCs that are going to be owning the properties, so we have to register the 8 LLCs in Maryland too.
Gotcha. Interesting. I know Delaware. I know a lot of investors are a big fan of Delaware. I've actually used Delaware before. We're currently set up where we have Virginia, where I originally started investing in properties, and then now I have foreign entities. But Maryland takes the income tax right out at closing. I didn't think they took it out because we have the LLCs.
You're right.
In Maryland.
They're not going to withhold.
Yes.
Because they're registered in Maryland. That doesn't mean you don't have to pay the tax.
Okay, so we were talking about the same thing.
You get around the withholding. That is correct.
Yes.
But you don't get around the liability.
We still have to pay it at the end of the year, but we don't have to pay it when we sell the property. When you have a local Virginia or a Nevada LLC and you sell a property in Maryland, you have to pay your income tax at the sale. So it's not, you don't wait until tax time, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but you pay it at sale. So if you close in the middle of the year, you close January 1st, well, you're paying Maryland its tax right there, January, for that next. This is why I have you on, Jake, not me. This is why you're the professional.
Delaware. Delaware is what I use, not for the series LLCs. I use Delaware when we talk about that outside liability. Somebody gets in that car accident and they want to protect their assets. In Maryland, the law is if I set up a trust and I put my assets into a trust, it's called a self-settled trust. It's not protected from creditors. Delaware allows you to put assets into an asset protection trust, and even though it's self-settled, it's protected from your creditors. So if, God forbid, I get into a car accident, somebody sues me, and I have a brokerage account that's owned by a Delaware asset protection trust, that should be protected from the creditors. But the absolute best way for outside liabilities to protect your assets
Mm-hmm.
is if you're married to own them tenants by the entirety. Joint assets are protected from collection of any individual's liability in Maryland. So if either husband or wife have their individual liabilities, the debtor cannot collect from assets that are titled in husband and wife's name. Off limits.
Gotcha. Because you'd be taking from the other party that's not
It's the
involved
power
in
of
whatever
marriage.
incident.
It's the power of
Gotcha.
marriage, exactly. So if
Interesting.
someone's married, very often, and this is part of my estate planning side of things, where I see assets are always constantly in one of the spouse's names, I always tell them, you got to put it in tenants by the entirety, because at what point you're going to have a joint liability, right? I mean, if they're both liable for something, then yes, they can go after joint assets, but usually it's one or the other. And if there's someone single or widowed or whatever it is, obviously then you got to deal with potentially that Delaware trust maybe. Every situation is different.
And for the tenants in the entirety, are you talking about rental properties? Or are you talking about like personal residences? That's what this advice is for.
We're talking about brokerage accounts, other assets. For sure, your primary residence should be tenants by the entirety. Absolutely.
Gotcha.
But a rental property, you never want to have tenants by the entirety, because that means that you're now both jointly liable, right? There's it depends where the liability is stemming from, right? When I'm driving my car, my wife's not driving with me, right? It's only one of us that's going to be liable.
Mm-hmm.
If we're both on a rental property, that's joint liability. Now they can go after all of our joint assets.
That's huge.
So you always want the properties being in one, or the LLCs. The LLC sometimes can be owned by both as tenants by the entirety, because that's already shielded. The LLC is a shield.
Gotcha. Yeah, but you're just saying that you don't want, for instance, you don't want a drywall to fall on the tenant's head, and you are owning the property as tenants in entirety, not under an LLC, and they go after it and they name everybody that's on that property. So you,
Correct.
your wife, your property manager,
and they can go after your primary residence.
Installed.
Right.
Gotcha.
Right.
I appreciate you sharing all that. It's all good stuff. Why is asset protection important?
Okay, so when we talk about asset protection, there's really two aspects of asset protection. Everybody here is pretty much a real estate professional. You want to protect your assets. There could be liabilities stemming from the real estate business. There could be liabilities that stem beyond the real estate business. So you have inside liabilities, let's call it, which come from the real estate business itself, and then you have outside liabilities. Let's just take an example. If I have an LLC that owns 5 rental properties, and I also have a brokerage account in my own name that has $1 million. If there's an issue with one of the rental properties, somebody slips and falls, there's a fire, whatever the case may be, there's liability. That's inside liability. They're limited to collect from the assets within the LLC. There are 5 properties, so whatever the equity is in the properties, that's subject to collection of that liability. They cannot go after your brokerage account because that's outside of the LLC. But conversely, if let's say you get into a car accident, that's an outside liability. Now you get sued individually. Because you're getting sued individually, they can go after all of your assets. They can go after your LLC if you own it individually, although we'll talk about that in a second. That may be a little bit more difficult. They can go after your brokerage account. So asset protection is to protect within inside liability as best as possible, so that if there's an issue that arises from one of your properties, they can only go after the equity in that one property, right? That problem property, let's call it. There's also an aspect of asset protection for outside liability. I don't want anybody going after my brokerage account if I get into a car accident. That issue really applies to anybody, no matter what industry you're in. But we don't really hear about that so much because it doesn't really come up so often. Everybody has insurance. What other outside liability could there be? Unless you are, let's say a plumber and you leave a tool in the house and somebody slips and falls. Those are the 2 different types of asset protection planning that's necessary to make sure that somebody is protected from liability.
What are the biggest mistakes you see newer investors making today?
Buying properties in their own name and keeping it there. I see it all the time. And some people get lucky and never have an issue. Again, there is that school of thought, like I have umbrella insurance. It's never going to be an issue until there's a fire and God forbid a kid passes away, which has happened.
Do you have a personal story that you can share?
Well, it's the fire story. The guy had a home in his own name, and there was a fire, and he's having a lot of issues. The insurance may have lapsed, and that's still at issue currently. Mm-hmm. And you can't transfer assets after the fact. That's a fraudulent conveyance. If you do that, you got to be careful. And an attorney who assists in a fraudulent conveyance also could be on the hook. So good luck finding an attorney who's going to move around your assets when you're doing it just to avoid a potential liability. That's number 1 mistake for sure. The number 2 mistake is buying 20 properties in one LLC for the same reason, or buying for cash, not leveraging properties. If they're leveraged, you already have the cash in your pocket, or you put it elsewhere, and
Oh man,
they can only go after the equity.
would you say instead of having a property amount, it actually should be an equity amount per LLC? So instead of saying, I know a lot of people's generic advice that I see on forums are, hey, I have 4 or 5 properties per LLC. Would you say, hey, you should have $750,000 per LLC? Is there a number that you can say, hey, this is my general advice that I'd say, hey, once you have this amount of equity, you need to be done with that LLC, move on to the next one for every single property?
Yeah, I mean, it's an individual tolerance question. How much risk are they willing to take? What kind of exposure are they willing to take? And again, you can have 20 properties in an LLC if there's no equity. Like you have 80%, LTV, whatever it is, finance, a primary lender, and then you're using marital assets for the balance. We would put a mortgage on the property, right? We would make a loan from, let's say, wife to the LLC. We would use an IDOT, so there's no recordation tax. The properties are pledged as security to the spouse for the marital assets that are used. And now there's no equity. So you can have 20 properties within that LLC, because good luck finding a lawyer who's going to take on a case to sue an LLC that essentially has assets that are valued at zero.
Or underwater.
Correct. Because when you sell the properties, you got to satisfy the mortgages, and some of them's going to the wife. The wife's not liable for anything.
That brings up a great question. If somebody has, let's say, one asset and it has $2 million worth of equity, is the protection, hey, do a refinance and then transfer that money over to a different LLC? Is that the protection? Or
if there's a lot of equity in a property, obviously number one is insurance. We're talking about now an inside liability. If that's the only property within the LLC and something goes wrong at that property, they're going to sue the LLC and they're going to try to get out the equity. So yes, you want to minimize the equity as much as possible, whether that's financing it, right? Refinancing. Absolutely. That's pretty much the only way to get around that.
That is going to be the theme. Minimize your equity in LLCs. I like it a lot. I think that's going to be very valuable for investors. In your experience, what entity structures do you see most successful real estate investors use? So I'll lay out the picture. Hey, a newer investor that's just done their first deal and they want to look down the road, down the tunnel. They want to say, how am I going to be operating? I mean, because investors change the way they operate over time, but how are they going to be operating when they have, let's say 50 units like us or 200 units? Are they going to be operating differently, or is it going to be the same structure, a minimum amount of equity per LLC, and then the same thing for the next LLC? And is that going to be?
We'll have the conversation about, one LLC per property and, looking at on a global level versus a per property level. Then we'll talk about bunching properties within an LLC and then moving on to the next LLC and having a parent company so that you don't file multiple tax returns. That all flows up to a parent company. We'll talk about if they're self-managing it, having a self-management company. Getting back to your recent question about the biggest mistake is some clients will have a parent company that'll own, let's say, 5 subsidiary LLCs. Each subsidiary LLC owns 5 properties, so 25 properties. They'll make the parent company the management company. The management company is going to be the first entity to be sued together with the entity on title. And now the parent company is being sued for an issue that they did with screwing up in some management capacity. And now all of their assets are subject to collection. They own a lot of subsidiary LLCs. Those LLCs can be collected as well. That's another mistake. So again, individual property per LLC. Then we'll talk about bunching properties per LLC. Then we'll talk about the statutory trust concept and see what's best for them. When somebody's starting out, buy your first property in an LLC. Gotcha. Or buy it in your own name, and then we'll transfer afterwards to an LLC because of your mortgage rate.
And for those people that have the structure, a management company and then multiple LLCs that the properties are owned, would you just put another LLC on top that's not managing, that has no relation, totally obscure? It's just
not even on top. I would have a separate management company entirely off of the chart. Okay, a shell entity that's owned by whoever, that basically collects the rent and then distributes it out to whoever its clients are. Have it as a shell entity, because the management company is going to get sued. And you don't want them to have any assets. Money come in, money come out.
Great advice. Do you have any advice on what you named the LLCs? Would you name the LLC the same name as the property address? Would you name the LLC something completely different?
I give the clients a choice. I mean, some to maintain anonymity. It's not a good idea to name your LLC David Hathaway LLC, obviously. If somebody wants to find you, though, they'll be able to find you because they'll see, on the HUD-1, right, the closing statement, they'll be able to see who's signing on behalf of the entity. There are some clients that hire somebody off the street to be the person to sign as an authorized person. You can never find who owns this. You used to be able to have a PO box. Now you can't. But, they'll have a generic office as the mailing address. And the theme of maintaining anonymity, some people like to use the address as the LLC.
That some people get properties confused because they use two similar LLC names, and then they accidentally close in the wrong name because they get them confused.
Yeah, and another issue is just when an entity is forfeited, you can use that name and set up a new entity. People do that. The problem is, though, when you apply for an EIN, the IRS is going to cause issues because they've already issued an EIN to an entity with the same name in Maryland, and now you want to get an EIN because you set up the same entity that was previously forfeited, right? Now it's a new entity for me. You're going to have to submit proof to the IRS. So never choose a name that's forfeited, even though it's available.
Standard costs, did cost vary from state to state? Should somebody even think about like, hey, it costs an extra $100 to do LLCs in Nevada over Maryland? Should that even weigh into your thinking of like the cost of setting up the entities?
Well, remember, anytime that you set up an entity out of state that owns property in Maryland, you're going to have to register it in Maryland anyway. You're going to be paying the same exact fees, the $154.50 to set it up regular expedited in Maryland, and $300 annual fee. As far as out-of-state filings, Delaware seems to be a little bit more on the expensive side. In Nevada, the annual filing fee is combined to $350 instead of $300. Every state's different. But here in Maryland, you can file super expedited if you need the LLC to be on record the same day or the next day. It's like close to $500. Otherwise, it's $154.50 for the regular expedited, which is about 8 to 12 days it'll be on record. There's the $300 annual filing fee, obviously, to keep it in good standing.
The most of our viewers are actually interested in Baltimore, is what I found. People always reach out to me and say, hey, I'm interested in Baltimore. I see you're doing a lot of rental properties in Baltimore. Do you recommend to avoid those fees? I guess it's on a case-by-case basis. Do you recommend them just go directly and just open up their LLC in the state of Maryland? Or do you recommend opening in Nevada and Maryland? Or does it all depend on the amount of equities in the property?
Yeah, I mean, I rarely do Nevada or Alaska or anywhere else. I mean, why not just stick with Maryland? In a situation where you want the series LLC as opposed to a statutory trust because you're financing and you're dealing with a lender, then we'll use Nevada. Otherwise, why not just stick with Maryland? Maryland LLCs, very rarely do we have properties owned by an out-of-state entity. There's really no reason to. Maryland's LLC protection laws are great. As far as Baltimore City goes, be careful with lead paint because that's something that's extremely important, and I should have touched on it earlier.
Yeah.
No matter what method or structure you put in place in Baltimore City, there's a case called the Dachman case. The Dachman case says that lead paint, they pierce the corporate veil. They can go all the way up the chain to a warm body. There's no protection in Baltimore City from lead paint liability. So either buy in Baltimore County or outside Baltimore City. But if you're buying in Baltimore City, you got to make sure that it's lead-free. If it's not lead-free, be careful on who your tenants are. It used to be that insurance would cover lead paint. So more attorneys took on lead paint cases. Now, with insurance coverage not really covering lead paint, most attorneys stopped taking lead paint lawsuits. We have a lead paint defense practice here at our office. Deborah Cruz, she's great. But those cases have been, really becoming less and less every year because fewer attorneys are taking them on. But just be careful with that. That's very important to know and make sure that it's lead-free.
That should have been the intro. Like, if you have lead in your properties, entity structure doesn't even matter if you get sued. I mean, that's pretty crazy. That's something news to me. So that is super important, especially for people thinking about investing in Baltimore City. I've actually heard some horror stories about lead paint. I know investors that have sold all of their properties that have lead. I know investors that will not invest in rental properties that have lead. So definitely something that you should consult with an attorney like Jacob on, or just have that in your back of your head. Don't just look at the numbers and think, oh, these numbers are amazing. There's other risks involved in those rental properties that have lead-based paint. And you can find that out through MDE. It should be disclosed whether...
Due diligence, I mean, you should see the lead certificate. Right.
And sometimes owners will just say, I don't have any knowledge. It might have lead, it might not. You need to dig a little bit deeper. Or you can also, during your inspection phase, have a lead probe go over and test to see if there's lead, and they can say, hey, you do have lead or you don't have lead, so you can push forward or not. So yeah, definitely part of your due diligence. Before we go into the fire round, I'm just going to give you a bunch of just quick rapid fire questions to let you go with. If you've stuck around this far, guys, and you think that this is valuable content, we'd love you like and subscribe to the video, to the channel. We appreciate it. But with that said, we'll go into the fire round. Jake, when should an investor get in touch with an attorney in their investment journey? Is it before they even purchase a property? Is it when they purchase a property? What does that look like?
Typically before. I get calls all the time and I'll tell them, what to look for, how to buy the property, different options. After the fact, we can always, play around with the statutes and try to transfer the properties into the right entities, using the exemptions that you don't pay transfer accreditation tax again. Mm-hmm. Anytime that there's a lender on the property, obviously, You got to be careful with triggering a due on sale clause by making a transfer without lender's consent. So before you buy a property, before you get going, is a good time to call. I'll take anybody's call for 5-10 minutes to explain to them, discuss, and then once they buy the properties, we can then implement the plan or structure. We can help them set up the entity from the get-go if they need.
And if you start with Jake's first advice, which is don't buy in your personal name, then he won't yell at you over the phone and go, why did you buy in your personal name? You buy in an LLC at the very least, then you can start structuring your business and you're set up the right way.
Right.
So,
but again, some do buy it in their individual name strategically to get the better rate. And then without telling the lender, they'll transfer it into an LLC. I think lenders know that this happens. If you tell them from the get-go, they might not be happy. People take that risk where they transfer it after the fact.
Gotcha. Should real estate investors that are flippers or deal in wholesale or buy and hold investors that are looking for pure rental properties, should any of those things look different, or your recommendation is for all of those real estate specialties that they all just use LLCs?
Yeah, I would stick to LLCs and I would keep everything separate. So there are those who wholesale and fix and flip and buy and hold and keep everything separate.
Different businesses, different LLCs,
Exactly.
different bank accounts.
Wholesale, is ripe for liability. I mean, so often I get calls where one of the parties is in default, and whether it's the seller, the wholesaler, the end buyer, you want to keep everything separate and try to use shell entities as much as possible. Wholesalers also a separate conversation where if the property is owned in an LLC, you can sometimes actually sell the LLC itself through a subsidiary to avoid the transfer acquisition tax. But if you're fix and flipping, keep those in a separate LLC. Don't commingle them with the wholesale LLC. Don't commingle them with the buy and hold rental LLC.
My advice to most newer investors is treat it like a business, because we often commingle stuff. I mean, I used to commingle things at the very start of my real estate investing career, and now I separate everything almost to a fault, because I also have a philosophy of simplicity. I think you can overcomplicate things and then you create your own issues there. But it's separate email accounts for different businesses, where if like you have a wholesale business that has an email account, so you can keep everything separate and find it. And then if you have a construction business, you have a separate email, separate bank account. And so it's easier to find, it's easier for bookkeepers, it's easier for your attorneys, and say, hey, this is everything that we've ever done for this business here. I like that advice a lot, but a lot of times people are like, oh man, it's just easier to commingle everything together. But then you're opening yourself up to that basket of worms of, hey, I'm suing you. Now I'm suing your construction company. Now I'm suing you for your properties now, because you do everything together and you don't separate anything.
Yeah. And a big, one of the greatest lines I've ever heard is that cost is an issue in the absence of value. And the value of spending money to keep things separate, you can't put a number on it, for the headaches that people have to deal with. So cost is an issue in the absence of value.
Gotcha. This is a personal question that I'm going to throw out there for investors that invest in real estate syndications. I mean, some of our viewers, do you invest in your personal name, or would you recommend that person to invest in their LLC if they're invested in, let's say, 3 syndications, and let's say they put 100,000, 100,000, 100,000? What's your recommendation there?
Individual name. And I do that myself. If I'm investing in a deal, that a deal is owned by an LLC, and there might be multiple layers depending on how complex it is, I'll put the money in it. Why? I mean, why not? If I own it in an LLC, again, if there's that outside liability, sometimes it's harder to collect, to foreclose on an LLC. But if I'm a single member, they'll probably take the whole LLC away anyway. Maybe if it's a partnership with, between myself and my wife, and you can change the provisions in the operator, that's already too complex. Personally, I'm not really too concerned with outside liability, right? The main concern is with the inside liability stemming from the real estate. Well, in that case, it's owned by an LLC. So I can own the LLC interest in my individual name. It doesn't really bother me. So that's
gotcha.
how I do.
And that is individual name. Is that also for that you get hit by a car, that it just passes on directly to your right of survivorship, or no? And you die, God forbid, we all hope that doesn't happen, but does it go right to your wife?
I mean, so if my estate planning document says that upon my death, my wife gets all my assets, then she's going to get my interest in the LLC. So instead of it being Jacob Rappaport owning 20% or 5% or 2% of investment LLC, now my wife will own that, and it'll just be an assignment. And that's not an issue ever. So
last fire round question, what should investors or just people be thinking about for estate planning? Even if they're reaching out to you, what should they be thinking about? What questions should they be asking about estate planning? Is it trusts? Is it wills? Is it?
Yeah, I mean, all that. They should be asking themselves, if God forbid I pass away tomorrow, what's going to happen to my empire, let's call it, right? Am I properly set up? for everything to pass well, it'll go to the spouse typically, and then maybe there'll be a fire sale, or is something in place. You have somebody involved in the business who knows it. It's really the most important thing is organization and knowledge. Besides for setting up your estate planning documents so the assets go to where you want it to go after a person passes away, somebody really has to be aware of and know what your assets are, where they're located, where you bank, right? List, a master list of all your assets, usernames and passwords. It's critical. And when I do estate planning with clients, I give them, the option of, we can keep it in our file if you want. Some clients actually give us all their usernames and passwords, believe it or not. I don't think any trying to access anybody's account is not worth my license. Provides them with, protection and knowledge that somebody has the knowledge of wherever their assets are and how to access online account. But everybody's really got to think about that. What happens if I'm not around? Are my assets going to go to where I want them to go? Who's going to be in charge? Who's going to be my executor? Trustees for children? If I am the surviving spouse, you might want to implement a probate avoidance structure in place with a revocable living trust. These are all things that everybody's got to think about at some point.
Gotcha. Thank you for sharing. And instead of me summarizing, which I often do in all the videos, if you were to summarize what we've chatted about to the very basic bare bones, I know LLCs, put it in LLC, stay away from your personal name. I mean, what are the other super takeaways that you want investors to be like, hey, you got to do this or you are setting yourself up for failure?
All of your other assets that are not your LLCs, to the extent possible, should be jointly titled. If they're not able to be jointly titled, like a retirement account, that's also protected anyway. So that's number 2, is to make sure that your other assets are jointly titled if there is another spouse involved. If you're married, have it jointly titled.
Gotcha. You don't want to be the one guy that has, God forbid, your property catches on fire, somebody dies in it, and then they're coming after everything because you just put it in your personal name. That is the last place you want to be. And I've been sued a couple of times from tenants, and it's not a fun place to be, especially when you see that document that says, hey, we're asking for $1.5 million. And it's over something like, and for my instance, is like a drop ceiling falling on somebody's head. Its own thing, but hey, I mean, I guess it could. I guess that could have happened. But hey, set yourself up right. We really appreciate you guys listening in. Jake, I really appreciate you giving us the time, your wisdom.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing it. If people want to reach out to you, they have questions on entity structure, on operating agreement docs, best way to reach you.
The best way is probably by email, jrappaport@levingan.com. They can always call me. My direct dial is 410-321-4641.
Appreciate that. Coming on and giving people, your wisdom. We appreciate that. Guys, if you like this, again, we'd love if you like and subscribe to the channel. We'll put Jake's contact information in the description. You don't have to try to write it down, rewind the video a bunch of times. We'll have it down in the description. Just go down in the description of the video and you can find him, reach out to him. And we'll see you on another real estate educational episode, guys.